The footage was 41 seconds long. It had no sound. And when the wildlife biologist who studied black bears in the northern Rockies watched it for the first time, she watched it 3 more times before she said anything. And what she said was not the kind of thing a scientist is supposed to say. But that was later. Before any of it, there was a little girl standing at a window in the dark. Willa was 7 years old and had been awake since before 5 in the morning. Her grandmother's house sat at the edge of a tree line in the high country of northwestern Montana, where the forest pushed close enough to the back fence that in summer, the shadow of the pines reached all the way to the kitchen door before noon. Willa had been staying there for 4 days. She had not once slept past 5. Her grandmother, Marin, thought it was the mountain air, or the quiet, or the strangeness of being somewhere new. She did not know yet that Willa was waking up for a reason. That morning, Willa pressed her face against the cold glass of the living room window and watched the edge of the trees for nearly 20 minutes without moving. When Marin found her there, the girl's breath had fogged the lower pane into white. Marin asked her what she was looking at. Willa said she was looking at the bear. Marin looked. The tree line was dark and still. Whatever might be standing inside, it could not be seen from where they were. She told Willa gently that there was nothing there, that it was too early, that bears did not usually come that close, and she brought her granddaughter back to bed and sat with her until she fell asleep again. She should have checked the camera. The small trail camera mounted on the fence post at the back of the property had been installed by Marin's late husband, Garrett, 7 years before, after a young black bear had torn through the kitchen garden 2 summers in a row. Garrett had set it up himself on a Saturday afternoon, laughing at how seriously he was taking the project, and it had recorded passing deer and raccoons, and once a pair of coyotes, for years before the battery started dying, and Marin stopped checking it. After Garrett died, she had replaced the battery because it felt like something he would have wanted her to do. She had not looked at the footage in almost a year. When her son-in-law, David, drove up from Missoula that weekend to pick up Willa, Marin mentioned the morning at the window as the kind of story you tell about small children. Something to smile at. David did not smile. He asked which fence line. He asked how many mornings. He asked if there was a camera. Marin told him about the camera on the post, and David went outside and found it and brought it inside and sat at the kitchen table and started pulling footage. Marin stood behind him with her coffee going cold. And when the footage from 5 days ago came up, what was recorded on it made both of them very quiet for a long time. That was the beginning. Or rather, it was the point at which they understood the beginning had happened weeks before anyone was paying attention. What had brought Willa to that house in the first place was not complicated. Her mother, Janelle, Marin's daughter, had taken a new position with a surveying firm and needed 10 days to complete a certification course in Calgary. David had his own work. Willa was the kind of child who would have been fine anywhere, but she and her grandmother had a particular closeness that the family had long since stopped trying to explain. Willa liked to follow Marin through the garden and through the kitchen and through the hardware store in town, and Marin liked having her. It had always been that way. The house itself was the kind of place that takes a long time to describe because it feels wrong to flatten it into specifics. It had been built in the early 90s on 22 acres, most of it forest, some of it meadow, all of it above 5,000 feet. Garrett had designed the addition himself and built the deck by hand and run the fence line around the back property when the kids were small. Every physical thing about the property had his involvement somewhere in its history. After he died, 14 months before Willa's visit, Marin had not changed anything. She told herself that was practical. She was not sure it was. Willa arrived on a Thursday evening with a small blue bag and a wooden object she kept in her left jacket pocket, and it was the first thing Marin noticed about her. The object was a carved black bear, no longer than a finger, worn smooth from handling. Garrett had made it 2 winters before he died, working from a piece of ponderosa pine he had found on the lower property, and he had given it to Willa at Christmas when she was 5. She had not gone anywhere without it since. Marin held it for a moment when Willa showed her, turned it in her hands the way you turn something precious that belongs to someone else. It was simple work, no great artistry in it, just the clean outline of a bear on all 4s, the head down and the shoulders broad. She handed it back, and Willa put it directly into her pocket, the way children put things back that they have only loaned to you for a moment. The first evening was easy and warm. They made soup together and watched an old animated film Marin had found in a cabinet and went to bed early. Marin did not hear Willa get up in the night. The second morning was the same. Normal, ordinary, a walk through the lower meadow, Willa finding rocks and pine cones and bringing them to Marin with the seriousness of a scientist presenting data. Nothing strange. Nothing that flagged. What Marin did not know, those first 2 days, was that the carved bear in Willa's pocket had a history more specific than she had let herself think about. Garrett had made it during the last winter he was healthy, which was also the last winter he and Marin had spent entirely at the house without a single medical appointment pulling them toward Missoula or Kalispell. That was the winter before the diagnosis, before the scans and the second opinions and the particular education that comes from learning to read another person's face in the light of bad news. The winter before all of that, he had spent evenings at the kitchen table with a small knife and a piece of pine from the lower property, working the wood down slowly, and Marin had sat across from him reading or not reading, and the sound of the knife on wood had been the sound of the house in the evenings for a while. He had made several things that winter. A rough fish, a bird that did not quite look like any bird, and the bear, which was the best of them, the one where his hands seemed to have understood what they were doing before his mind did, because it came out right in a way the others had not. The head was down in the posture bears use when they are tracking scent. The shoulders were heavy. The whole thing sat in your palm and had weight to it that did not match its size. He had given it to Willa at Christmas, and she had held it in both hands, the way children hold things they already understand are important. Garrett died 8 months later. Marin had been with him at the end. Chanel had been there. The hospice nurse had been there. The room had been very quiet, and then it had been quiet in a different way. And Marin had driven home alone on a road she had driven 10,000 times and had sat in the kitchen for a long time. And in the morning, the house was exactly the same, and Garrett was gone. And she had not yet understood how those 2 things could both be true at once. Willa had cried at the funeral with the absolute unguarded grief of a child who does not yet know that there are people watching. That grief has a public version and a private one, and Marin had held her through it and felt that the child's crying was the most honest thing happening in that building. Willa had not cried about it since. She had not talked about it much. She carried the carved bear, and she did not explain why, and no one asked her to. But the trail camera had already been recording for weeks. The footage David pulled up at the kitchen table was not from that morning. It was from 3 weeks before Willa arrived, the first of what the camera had captured, and it showed a black bear standing at the fence line at approximately 4:20 in the morning. That, by itself, was not remarkable. Bears moved through the area regularly enough. Marin had seen scat along the lower trail and the occasional turned-over log in the meadow, and she had never been afraid of them. Black bears in that part of Montana were cautious, generally non-confrontational, and avoided the house. What was on this footage was different. The bear was not passing through. It was standing at the fence, facing the house directly, and it was standing still. The camera's motion sensor light had triggered, and the bear was fully illuminated, and it was looking, if looking is the right word, at the back of the house. at the window that faced the back property. At the window where, 3 weeks later, a 7-year-old girl would press her face against the glass before 5 in the morning and say there was a bear. David scrolled forward through the dates. The bear had been there 6 more times in the 3 weeks before Willa arrived. Always between 4 and 5:30 in the morning. Always at the same section of fence. Always facing the house. Never going over. Never damaging the fence. Never doing anything that could be described as threatening, and never doing quite enough to be fully explained either. Marin set her coffee down. She asked David when the first recording was. He told her. She did the math without speaking. The first time the bear had stood at that fence was 4 days after Garrett's memorial service, when Marin had driven home alone from the church and sat in the kitchen until late and then gone to bed without eating. David saw her face and did not say anything right away. Neither of them said the obvious thing, but they both thought it. There are things about black bears that wildlife researchers understand well. Their range, their diet, their seasonal behavior, their tendency to habituate to human presence, and their equally documented tendency to avoid it. There are things that are less well understood, including specific documented cases of bears returning repeatedly to locations associated with a particular person for reasons that do not fit the usual models. Marin had not known any of this. She was not a researcher. She was a 61-year-old woman who had spent the better part of 3 decades in that house and who knew the land around it the way you know a face, by feel rather than description, and what she felt, looking at the footage on her son-in-law's screen, was something she had no word for. She did not say it was Garrett. She was not the kind of person who said things like that. But she also knew the bear had started coming after Garrett died, and she knew what window it was standing in front of, and she knew that Willa had his carved bear in her pocket every day, and she sat with all of that and did not turn it into a conclusion. That night, after David and Willa had gone to bed, Marin went to the back window and stood there in the dark, the way Willa had stood, and she looked at the tree line, and the tree line looked back, and nothing moved for a long time. Then it did. It was not much. A shift in the dark between 2 pines, a movement low to the ground and heavy, and then it stopped. And then there was the sound, very faint, that large animals make when they shift their weight in underbrush. And then nothing again. Marin stood at the window for a long time after that. She did not tell David in the morning. She did not know what she would have said. What she did instead was what she had been doing for 14 months, which was to keep the shape of her ordinary life intact around the absence at the center of it. She made coffee at 6. She watered the kitchen garden before the heat came on. She drove to town on Wednesdays for groceries and spoke to the people she saw there with the warmth of someone who has learned, over a long time, how to be present in a conversation while being elsewhere entirely. She thought about Garrett constantly. Not painfully, not always. Sometimes it was something small, the angle of light in the afternoon on the back deck, the sound the screen door made, the particular smell of the lower meadow in the evening. She would notice it, and he would be there for a moment, and then he would not be, and she would go on doing whatever she was doing. She had been told by several people that it got easier. She believed them. She was also not certain easier was what she was looking for. She had not told anyone about standing at the back window that first night after David and Willa went to bed. She had not told anyone what she had seen move at the edge of the trees, the shape between the pines, the sound of weight shifting in underbrush. She held that the way she was holding the footage, the way she held most of the things that had happened since Garrett died, carefully, without pressing too hard on them. She was 61 years old, and she had been alone in that house for over a year, and she was not a woman given to wishful thinking. But she also knew that she did not have a satisfying explanation for what the camera had been recording, and she had learned, in the years since the diagnosis, that the absence of a satisfying explanation was not the same thing as the absence of meaning. The days that followed had a specific texture to them. Maren found herself checking the trail camera every morning before Willa woke, and every morning there was a new entry between 4 and 5, the same fence section, the same stillness, the bear present and unmoving, and then gone. She did not show Willa. She was not certain why. It felt like something that should be decided between adults before a child was brought into it, except that Willa was already in it, had been in it longer than anyone else, had been the one standing at the window in the dark, before any of them understood what was happening. Willa spent those days the way she always did, completely and without reserve, a kind of presence small children have before they learn to be self-conscious about how much they occupy a space. She helped with the garden. She climbed the fence to the lower meadow and then climbed back because she had been told not to go past it alone. She found a dead crow near the woodpile and brought it to Maren wrapped in a leaf with the gravity of a coroner delivering a report. She ate everything she was given and complained about none of it. Every morning she woke before 5. Every morning Maren found her at the window. On the second of those mornings, Maren asked her carefully what she saw when she looked out there. Willa thought about the question with the particular seriousness of children who understand they are being asked something real. She said that the bear came to look at the house. She said it came a lot. She said she thought it knew something about the house, though she could not have said what she meant by that, and Maren did not push her on it. Then Willa asked if she could go outside to see it. Maren said no. Willa accepted this without argument and went to get dressed, and the carved bear went into her pocket, and that was that. Maren thought, standing in the kitchen making breakfast, that this was probably fine, that the bear was curious, that Willa was a child who noticed things, that this was the kind of story that seemed significant while you were inside it and unremarkable once you stepped back. She thought that for approximately one more day. On the third morning, the camera footage showed something different. The bear had not stood at the fence. It had come through the gate, which Maren was certain she had latched, and stood in the garden for 11 minutes before returning to the trees. It had not touched anything in the garden. It had stood in the center of the vegetable beds, which Garrett had built and framed himself the spring before the diagnosis. And it had stood there for 11 minutes, and then it had left. Maren watched the timestamp on the footage twice to make sure she was reading it correctly. The bear had been inside the fence 11 minutes in the garden Garrett had built, and it had left without damage, without disturbance, without taking anything. She latched the gate more firmly that morning and did not tell Willa. But Willa was already changing in some way that Maren noticed without naming. The girl was still warm and cooperative and easy in all the practical ways. She ate her meals and helped where she was asked and went to bed without complaint. But there was a quality of attention in her that was directing itself outward, toward the back of the property, toward the trees, in the way that attention moves when something is calling at it from a direction you have been told not to go. She asked Maren twice more about going outside to see the bear. Maren said no twice more. On the fourth morning, the camera showed the bear at the gate again. This time it had not come through. It had stood at the gate for 6 minutes, with its nose to the latch, and then it had gone back to the fence line and stood there for another 20 minutes facing the house, and then it had walked into the trees. Maren did not look at that footage until after Willa was asleep. She sat at the kitchen table with her laptop, and she watched it 3 times, and she felt something she could not name, which was not fear and was not comfort, and was somewhere between them, a state of suspension in which she understood that something was happening, that she did not have the language for, and that pressing it into familiar language would reduce it to something it was not. She went to bed late. She did not sleep well. Willa was quieter than usual at lunch. Not withdrawn, not unhappy, just elsewhere. Her attention moving outward through the kitchen window to the back of the property, the way attention does when something is pulling at it. She ate her sandwich and drank her water and helped clear the plates, and then asked if she could sit on the back step. Marin said yes. She watched Willa through the window for a while. The girl sat on the wooden step with her hands in her lap and the carved bear visible in her right hand, turning it the way Garrett used to turn things when he was thinking. She was not looking at anything in particular, or she was looking at something Marin could not see. That afternoon, Marin called her daughter in Calgary. The call was ordinary logistics and check-ins, and how's she eating, and Marin did not mention the bear because she was still not sure what she would have said. She did mention that Willa seemed a little quiet, and Janelle laughed and said Willa was always quiet when she was planning something, and that had turned out to be true every single time. Marin went to sleep that night with the house locked. She had checked both doors twice. She had checked Willa at 9:30, and she was asleep with the carved bear on the knitstand, and the window in Willa's room was latched, or she believed it was latched. She woke at 4:47. She knew the time because she looked at the clock the moment she opened her eyes, with the specific alertness of someone who has not actually been deeply asleep, though she did not know that then. She lay still for a moment. The house was quiet. The particular quiet of high country in the small hours. Number wind, no creek, no road sounds. A quiet so complete it had its own weight. Something was wrong. She could not have named it. It was the kind of knowing that arrives before the reason does. The body reading something the mind has not yet processed. She got up and went down the hall to Willa's room and opened the door and stood there. The bed was empty. The window was open 2 inches at the bottom. The carved bear was gone from the knitstand. What happened in the next few minutes cannot be organized neatly because organization was not what Marin felt. She moved through the house calling Willa's name at a volume. She was trying to keep low enough not to escalate into panic and could not quite manage. She checked the bathroom, the living room, the kitchen, the front porch, and then she went to the back door and it was unlocked. She had locked it herself at 9. She went outside. The motion light on the back of the house triggered and threw everything into white. The fence, the garden, the path to the lower meadow, and she called Willa's name again, louder now, and her voice went out across the dark property and came back to her without an answer. The gate in the fence was open. Marin went through it. The meadow on the other side was dark, the moon enough to see by but barely, and the tree line at the far end was 40 meters away, and she could not see anything moving. She called Willa again. Nothing. She went further into the meadow, the grass wet against her ankles, the cold coming down from the ridgeline above the trees, and she was calling the child's name and thinking about every terrible thing at once. The drop-off on the west side of the lower meadow, the creek below it, the distance to the nearest road, the temperature, the dark, the forest, and the bear. She was thinking about all of it at the same time, and none of it was helping. She stopped in the middle of the meadow and stood still and made herself breathe. She heard something. It was very quiet. Not a voice, not a cry. It was a sound like grass, like something settled into grass and breathing softly. A low rhythmic sound she could not identify for a moment, and then she could, and she turned toward it, and she saw them. She saw them, and she did not move. She did not move for a long time. Later, Marin would try to describe what she saw to several different people, and she would always say the same thing, that her first instinct was not fear. She had expected fear. She had been crossing that meadow in the dark, imagining the worst things. And then she found something she had not imagined, and her body's first response was not adrenaline or alarm, or the sound a person makes when they see their grandchild in danger. It was silence. Willa was sitting in the grass at the edge of the tree line. She was sitting cross-legged the way children sit when they have planted themselves somewhere and intend to stay. Her back straight, her hands in her lap, her face tilted slightly upward. In front of her, close enough that Marin could hear it breathing from 20 feet away, was the bear. It was a black bear, large, a mature female by the build of it, the shoulder hump broad and low, the head heavy. It was standing on all fours, and it was not moving. It was attending to Willa in some way, whether looking or smelling or both, and there was something in the quality of that attention, in the stillness of both of them, that made the word dangerous feel like the wrong word, though Marin's hands were shaking. Willa's right hand was extended toward the bear. Her palm was open. The carved bear, Garrett's carving, was resting in the center of her palm. The bear lowered its head. It moved slowly, the way large animals move when they are not alarmed, bringing its nose down toward Willa's open hand, and it stayed there. It breathed in. The sound was audible across the meadow grass, a long deliberate inhalation, and then another. And then the bear lifted its head and held still again, and something passed between them in the dark that Marin could see was happening and could not describe. She did not move. Every instinct she had was pulling her toward the child, and every part of her that was rational understood that the wrong sound or the wrong step might shift whatever this was into something that could not be stopped. She stood in the wet grass, and she did not breathe. She had a memory in that moment that arrived without being summoned. It was of Garrett standing at the kitchen window 3 winters before his diagnosis, watching a doe that had wandered into the back garden and was eating from the winter kale. He had not moved. He had stood completely still with his coffee in his hand and watched the deer with an expression she had not seen on him in any other context, something between reverence and grief, as if the animal were something being briefly lent to the world, and he understood that moving would end the loan. She had stood behind him and watched him watching the deer, and she had loved him in that moment in a way that was different from the ordinary love of a long marriage, sharper and quieter at the same time. She thought about that now, standing in the cold meadow grass 20 feet from her granddaughter and a bear, and she did not move. The bear took 1 step back, then another. It turned its head toward the tree line once, and then it turned back to Willa, and Willa said something, 1 word, soft, that Marin could not hear from where she stood, though she would wonder about that word for a long time afterward. The bear turned and walked into the trees. It did not run. It did not startle. It simply turned and went into the darkness between the pines, unhurried, and in a few seconds it was gone. Willa sat still for a moment. Then she stood up and brushed the grass off her legs and turned around and saw her grandmother standing in the middle of the meadow, and her face showed the particular expression of a child who knows they have done something they were told not to do and is also not certain they regret it. Marin crossed the meadow. She did not run the last stretch because her legs would not let her run. She knelt down in the wet grass, and she held her granddaughter for a long time without speaking. Willa held her back with both arms. She still had the carving in her hand, and Marin could feel it pressed against her back, small and worn smooth and smelling of pine and something else she could not name. The motion camera had recorded all of it. David watched the footage at the kitchen table 2 days later. He watched it once. He watched it again. He watched it a 3rd time, and then he put the laptop down and looked at the window for a while. He was not an emotional man in the way that announces itself. He was steady and practical, and had been steady and practical through Garrett's illness and death, in a way that Marin had always quietly appreciated. But she watched him watching the footage, and she saw something move across his face that she recognized, because it was the same thing that had moved across hers. He asked her what she thought it meant. She told him she did not know. He asked if she thought it was connected to Garrett. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said that she thought the honest answer was that she did not have enough information to know what was connected to what, and that she was not certain that was the right question anyway. She said she thought the right question might be something simpler, something closer to the ground, which was just, what was happening and what did it want? David looked at her. She said she did not mean it in a supernatural way. She meant it in the way you mean it when an animal returns to the same place repeatedly, when it makes choices that suggest something other than hunger or territory or habit. What was it looking for? What had it come to do? Whether or not you could explain that in terms that fit a framework, the behavior was real and the question was real. David nodded slowly. He looked at the footage one more time. He looked at the 41 seconds of his daughter sitting cross-legged in the grass with her hand extended, the bear's heavy head coming down to her palm, the carved bear visible and small and warm in her open hand. He said he did not know what he would tell Janelle. Marin said she thought the truth was probably the right thing to tell. It showed Willa sitting in the grass at the edge of the tree line, her hand extended, the carved bear visible in her palm. It showed the bear standing in front of her, its head down, its attention completely on the child. It showed the bear lowering its nose to her hand. It showed the long pause, the stillness of both of them. It showed the bear stepping back and turning and walking into the trees. It showed Willa standing up and brushing herself off with the composure of someone completing an errand. David asked Marin if she had called anyone. She had called the Wildlife Management Office in Kalispell. The officer who came out reviewed the footage and asked careful questions, clinical and methodical, and he used words like unusual and atypical, and he wrote things down, and he did not say anything dismissive. Before he left, he could send the footage to a colleague who had been tracking bear behavior in that corridor for 8 years. The colleague was a wildlife biologist named Dr. Carla Sund, and she had spent enough years in the field to understand that rigor and wonder are not opposites. She was the one who watched the footage 3 times before she spoke. What she said when she did speak was this. In 18 years of fieldwork, she had documented 2 other cases of black bears returning repeatedly to a specific residential location over an extended period, with no food reward and no territorial explanation. In both cases, the behavior was associated with a specific individual. In both cases, that individual was deceased. She said she had no framework for the carving. She paused for a moment, and then she said what she knew about bear olfaction. She said that a bear's sense of smell is estimated at between 200 and 300 times more acute than a human's, capable of detecting scent embedded in objects, in wood, in the oils deposited by repeated human handling over years. She said that a small carved object carried in the pocket of a grieving person every day for 2 years would carry a scent profile unlike almost anything else in the world, specific and layered and saturated with the particular chemical language of a human life. The pine itself would carry something. The hours at the kitchen table, the hands that held the knife. She said she could not draw a scientific conclusion from the footage. She said that some things she had observed in her career, she was still finding the language for. The night after Willa left, Marin did something she had not done since Garrett died. She went to the back door and she unlocked it, and she left it that way. And she sat in the armchair that faced the window, and she waited, though she could not have said what she was waiting for. She fell asleep before anything happened, and woke up with the dawn coming in gray, and her neck stiff and her coffee gone cold on the side table. She looked out the back window. At the edge of the fence, in the early light, a shape was just crossing back into the tree line. It moved slowly, without urgency, the way something moves when it has accomplished whatever it came to do. She watched it until it was gone. She did not go back to sleep. Willa went home with David that afternoon. She hugged Marin for a long time at the car door, her face pressed against her grandmother's ribs. When the car was at the end of the driveway and pulling onto the gravel road, she rolled down the window and called back across the distance, something that Marin heard clearly despite the sound of the engine. She said the bear had smelled Grandpa. Then the window went up, and the car made the turn at the road and was gone. Marin stood in the driveway for a while. Then she went inside. She sat at the kitchen table. She looked at the wall. She thought about Garrett, who had mounted a camera on a fence post on a Saturday afternoon, laughing at himself for taking it so seriously. She thought about the morning after his memorial, when she had driven home alone and sat in the same kitchen until late. She thought about the footage and what had been standing at the fence 4 days after he was buried and what it had been looking at. She thought about the carved bear, the pine from the lower property, the piece he had found on a walk he used to take in the late afternoon when the light came low through the trees, the winter evenings at this table, the knife, the smell of fresh wood, the way Willa had held it at Christmas with both hands, already understanding what it was. She thought about how little we know of what moves through the world around us, and how much we assume we would recognize it if it arrived. She was still sitting at the table when it got dark. The wildlife biologist incorporated the footage into a file she kept on anomalous residential bear behavior. The wildlife officer kept a copy on record. David kept a copy on his phone, though he rarely opened it, and when he did, he always watched it more than once. But the original trail camera, the one Garrett had mounted on the fence post 7 years before, stayed where it was. Marin changed the battery and checked the footage every few days. And over the weeks that followed, she found what she had expected to find, which was that the bear was still coming. Still in the same window of early morning. Still at the same section of fence. Still facing the house. Willa called every Sunday from Missoula. Sometimes she asked about the bear, and Marin always said she thought it was still around. On one of those calls, Willa asked if the bear was sad. Marin thought about that for a long time before she answered. She said she did not think so. She said she thought it was looking for something, and that maybe it had found part of it, and that she was not sure what came next after that. Willa seemed satisfied with that answer, which surprised Marin. She had expected more questions. But Willa said okay and moved on to telling her about a frog she had found in the yard, and that was that, the way children move on, fully and without ceremony, leaving the harder things behind them like objects they have set down and do not need to carry anymore. Marin thought about that too. The last thing she told the wildlife biologist in a follow-up call 3 months later was that she had started leaving the back door unlocked at night. Not open, just unlocked. She did not know why she did that. It was not a practical decision. She did not expect anything to come through it. She just found that she could not lock it anymore and leave it that way and sleep easily. The biologist listened to this without comment. Then she said that in the 2 other cases she had mentioned, both families had reported doing something similar. Small adjustments to the way they lived in the house. Things they could not fully justify. A window left open. A light left on. A chair moved back to where it used to be before the person died. She said she had no explanation for any of it. She said she was not sure an explanation was the right thing to look for. The carved bear was still outside, in the grass where Willa had dropped it. It was wet with the morning and covered in bear saliva, and it smelled like something that had been held for a long time.